I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Peter Massini. He's a director of Future Nature Consulting. Peter has spent the majority of his 30-year professional career as an urban ecologist and green infrastructure policymaker. For the past 10 years, he has led on green infrastructure and natural environment policy for the Greater London Authority in the UK. He successfully embedded a policy framework in the London Plan and London Environment Strategy that aims to make London a greener, more livable and resilient city. So in his presentation, Peter will present an overview of greening metrics that are used in the policy and discussing some of the challenges and drawbacks and how effective they are in practice. So give a warm welcome to Mr. Peter Massini. Thank you, Peter.
Hi, my name is Peter Massini and I'm the Director of Future Nature Consulting Limited. And I'm going to be talking to you today about urban greening policy with a particular focus on London, where I worked for a number of years. And to discuss how I think that we're actually at a tipping point in terms of urban greening, moving away from greening for aesthetic and recreational purposes to greening to address some of the major challenges of our time. It's probably worth saying this is not new. The Open Space Plan of London from 1945 envisaged a network of parks that would provide space for recreation, for public health, something that was essential to the regeneration of London post-war. But of course, London has changed significantly since then. It's now a city of 8 million people, projected to be 10, 12 million people by 2050. And it's become a denser, more compact city. A city that needs to be contained in its own footprint to ensure it becomes a sustainable city. There's a conundrum there. How do we retain and create a dense, sustainable, greener city? How do we actually have more development and greener space and a greener city? It seems an unenviable challenge, an impossibility. But the policy frameworks now being developed in London and many other cities are rising to that challenge and addressing this fundamental issue. And of course, it's driven by some key considerations for the future. First and foremost is climate. We know the climate is changing. We know our cities have to adapt to that changing climate. And conservation, not just the conservation of existing green spaces, but the conservation of biodiversity to maintain ecological systems even within the city for our own benefit, but also for the benefit of the other species that share the city with us. And last but not least, particularly after the end of this period of time, issues around public health. COVID has simply highlighted the significant issues we need to address in terms of public health in planning our cities of the future. And urban greening, green infrastructure has a major role to play in terms of public health. So how have we gone about the design and management of our cities? For years, we've been protecting green space. This is a nature reserve in West London. The space is protected to the planning system, but we haven't been that good at ensuring it integrates with neighbouring development. As I said, we have to become a denser, more compact city, and that's putting pressure on existing green spaces. But although this space is protected, having a development immediately adjacent to it without any thought about the integration between that development and that green space is not a particularly smart approach to planning and design. So we need to think about how green spaces are currently protected but not integrated. How do we actually create that better integration between green space and development? How do we blur the boundaries to ensure there's a seamless transition between green space, public realm and urban development? I mentioned climate change, and climate change is a significant threat to the city, not just a threat to our environment, but a threat to the economy of the city. This was a picture taken in the last heat wave in London, where shops in central London closed. It was just too hot to open the shops. People weren't travelling into central London because the tube was too hot, and workers working in those stores were complaining of the heat. This was back in 2016, but we now know this is becoming a much more frequent occurrence. And it's an economic issue, not just an environmental issue. Store owners, the managers of businesses in central London are getting increasingly concerned about the possibility of heat waves in central London disrupting their business, reducing footfall in central London. And on the other side of climate change, there's the problems of surface water flooding. Again, more frequent storms, more frequent winter and summer storms causing flooding. And that's exacerbated by the denser city. As we seal surfaces, as we create much denser urban environments, if we don't design them properly, we'll just continue to result in lots and lots of surface water flooding instances, which again is an economic issue as well as being a horrific consequence for business owners, homeowners whose houses and businesses are flooded. So what have we been doing? We've been doing a lot of work in recent years, planting trees, for example, greening the city, but not always in particularly smart ways. So this is a classic example of tree planting in the public realm, but it's tree planting that's planted but not plumbed in. There's a surface water drain in this area of public realm. This could have been designed as a tree planting scheme with sustainable drainage. And that's the space we need to move into. We need to be thinking about greening as functional greening, not just aesthetic greening. So what's the fundamental driver for that change in thinking about urban greening? Essentially, it's the spatial development framework for a city. And in London, that's the London Plan, which sets out how development spatially is organised, integrated, and what rules it has to follow in terms of its place within the urban environment. And in recent iterations of the London Plan, increasingly a suite of policies around green infrastructure have come to the fore. Policies that promote urban greening, things like green roofs and green walls, but also the protection of existing green space and things like promotion of river restoration and sustainable drainage, to make sure that we take a much more integrated way of managing and designing and planning the green infrastructure of a modern city. So what does that look like, and particularly with the new London Plan that was published earlier this year in March? We've moved from a position where green roofs were an adornment to buildings, to green roofs and walls as functional spaces and functional materials in the urban environment. So this document is a well worth looking at as a reference, how we've moved from policy to practice, how we've actually began to design green roofs, design green walls that provide space for people at roof level, that help cool the city, and also help to promote biodiversity. And perhaps one of the biggest achievements in the new London Plan is the introduction of an urban greening factor. This is based on policy that's been developed in other European cities, which was termed the green space factor, but we've adapted it in London into an urban greening factor. So what is an urban greening factor? Essentially, it's a relatively simple policy and calculation that encourages the installation and implementation of urban greening on all new developments, but urban greening that's functional. So this simple example here shows that if you have sealed surfaces, a bit of permeable paving and amenity grassland, your urban greening factor is relatively low. But if you put in additional features like green roofs, a wildflower meadow, extra tree planting, it bumps up your urban greening factor. And the London Plan policy requires that new residential development has an urban greening factor of at least 0.4 and new commercial development has an urban greening factor of 0.3. That doesn't sound a huge amount, but actually it's quite a challenging target in an urban context. So how's it calculated? Each of those different urban greening features, whether it's a green roof, a green wall, biodiverse landscaping, sustainable drainage, has a factor ascribed to it. So it weights those elements of urban greening which have better functional attributes. So a green wall that can store water, provide space for biodiversity, has a higher factor, a higher weighting than an area of amenity grassland. And it's simply a matter of working out the area of the different type of urban greening, multiplying it by the factor, and also by the area of that particular type of urban greening, adding them together and dividing them by the area of the plot, and that gives you your urban greening factor. As I said, it's quite challenging to achieve, but since its implementation early this year, many developers have risen to the challenge and have really thought hard about how they design a new development to optimize urban greening, to deliver a range of benefits and meet that urban greening factor score. Now, the other big change and challenge for cities is around biodiversity conservation, and many new developments, or government is actually is going to mandate biodiversity net gain in future developments. That's a particular challenge in urban areas where there's multiple objectives in terms of urban greening, whether it's climate change, public health, but also trying to meet a biodiversity net gain. Now, our experience in London is that if you apply the urban greening factor, 9 times out of 10, you'll also achieve biodiversity net gain because you're creating additional green features on a building, many of which will be beneficial to wildlife. And just tweaks in the design of your green roof or tweaks in the design of your sustainable drainage system will also reap rewards for biodiversity and help you meet that biodiversity net gain requirement. And the GLA has just published guidance about urban greening and biodiversity net gain, how the two can complement each other. So what does this approach look like in practice? How does the urban greening factor, the suite of policies and green infrastructure, actually change the way we plan, design and manage new developments? This is an example on the edge of the Olympic Park. It looks like a fantastic habitat for dragonflies and newts and frogs, a great place to go for a walk on a Sunday morning, and it is. It's a fantastic piece of natural habitat. But it's not just a piece of natural habitat. It's not designed solely to provide benefits of biodiversity. It's actually part of the sustainable drainage system for this new development adjacent to the Olympic Park. Now, some people might be quite horrified by this notion of tall, dense urban living. But if we are going to make London a sustainable city, and many other cities too, that notion of dense urban living has to be something which we plan and design for, but doing it in ways that provide space for people, space for wildlife, but those functional benefits around climate change and public health. So that pond up in the top left-hand corner is essentially the end of the suds train. So the water is collected on the roofs, drains into suds and swales, and then percolates into that pond, and then is released into the River Lee. So providing that functional green infrastructure benefit, but also providing fantastic habitat for wildlife. Now, we also need to recognise that urban greening in cities is engineering as much as planting trees and wildflowers and new habitat. Most cities don't have much soil or underground surfaces which are conducive to planting and greening, particularly in the centre of cities. So again, many people are quite taken aback by the notion of putting in plastic crates into the ground to support urban greening. But as many of you will know, there are a whole range of systems that can be put in place now, which can support and create soil space in tight urban environments that allow trees and plants and sustainable drainage systems to be put in place and to flourish. Without these systems, we'd be planting trees and other vegetation into pretty sterile environments and they would struggle to grow. So by using these kind of systems, you create space below the ground for the trees to really get their roots into the ground, and that enables you to have trees which will flourish and grow into large canopies, which is what we need in cities. Trees with large canopies that can provide shade, that can provide soften the urban environment, and if designed well, contribute to mitigating the impacts of air pollution. Perhaps the biggest challenge of all is how we shift our thinking about the public realm, the urban realm in cities, which for the last 30, 40 years has been designed to accommodate the private vehicles, cars, lorries, also buses and taxis too. But the dominance of vehicular transport in cities has changed the very way in which we understand the public realm. We think about streets as thoroughfares for vehicles rather than civic space for everyone in the city. And we need to change the way we think about that space and how we plan and design it. This is not about removing cars completely, but it's about recognizing that the vehicle access is not the only requirement of a street or a piece of public realm. We need to think about public realm as spaces for the public, and that means elderly people, children, those who don't own cars, and design those spaces to provide good places for play, for relaxation, and ensure that our thoroughfares are designed to allow cars and vehicles to access new developments. And it's a fundamental rethinking about the way in which we use space in cities. And it's not just about new developments, it's not just about the hard public realm, it's also how we think about our parks and green spaces, and whether parks and green spaces also need to shift in their design and management to enable them to become spaces which provide the services that our city is going to need into the future. This is a park in Barking and Dagenham, designed in the 1930s as a recreational space, and at the time it was laid out very formally as a recreational space for people to use predominantly on a Sunday afternoon to meet friends, to socialise, to play sport. Those are still very important functions of green space of the future. We can also begin to tweak the way they're managed, to think about how those spaces can also provide space for nature and space through which we can adapt our city to impacts of climate change. So this is the same park. It used to have a river running through it. That river was diverted and pushed to the edge of the park in the formal layout. That river's now been put back into the park and created areas which can flood during heavy rainfall, protecting houses downstream, but also creating fantastic wildlife habitat. And we need to think about the function of that space in the future. What are the primary functions in the future? Is it perhaps climate change adaptation? Is it perhaps biodiversity conservation alongside recreation and amenity? And how do we design those spaces to meet all those requirements? Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion later in the day.